When Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin, seized power in the October Revolution of 1917, he promised bread, peace, and land to a population exhausted by 3 years of catastrophic world war. What followed instead was 7 years of chaos, bloodshed, economic collapse, and social engineering on a scale never before attempted in human history. The Soviet Union under Lenin was not the workers' paradise depicted in propaganda posters, nor was it simply a totalitarian nightmare. It was something far more complex and far more revealing about the nature of revolutionary ideology when it collides with the messy reality of governing a vast, diverse, and deeply fractured nation. The Bolshevik seizure of power on November 7, 1917, according to the Gregorian calendar, was almost absurdly simple. A few thousand Red Guards, revolutionary sailors from Kronstadt, and Bolshevik militants stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd, arrested the provisional government, and declared Soviet power. Lenin had been in hiding just weeks before, his party considered a fringe element even among socialist factions. The Bolsheviks held perhaps 25% support in the cities and far less in the countryside. Yet, through a combination of ruthless organization, political timing, and the utter exhaustion of their opponents, they took control of the world's largest country. The ease of this seizure would prove deceptive. Holding power would require methods that would shock even some of Lenin's own supporters. The first months of Bolshevik rule revealed the immense gap between revolutionary theory and administrative reality. Lenin's government immediately issued dramatic decrees. The decree on peace called for an immediate end to World War I without annexations or indemnities. The decree on land abolished private property in land and authorized peasants to seize estates. The decree on workers' control gave factory committees authority over production. On paper, these measures seemed to fulfill Bolshevik promises. In practice, they unleashed forces the new government could barely control. Peasants interpreted land redistribution as license to seize everything, including tools, livestock, and grain stores. Workers' control often meant workers voting themselves higher wages while production collapsed. The army, already disintegrating, dissolved entirely as soldiers abandoned the front to claim their share of redistributed land. Lenin faced an immediate crisis that would define his entire tenure. The Constituent Assembly, elected in November 1917 with universal suffrage, gave the Bolsheviks only 25% of seats. The socialist revolutionaries, representing the peasantry, won a clear majority. When the assembly convened on January 18, 1918, Lenin allowed it to sit for exactly 13 hours before Red Guards dissolved it at gunpoint. This single act revealed the fundamental contradiction of Leninist rule. The Bolsheviks claimed to represent the will of the workers and peasants. Yet when those workers and peasants voted for someone else, democratic results were dismissed as false consciousness. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly meant that Soviet power would rest not on popular mandate, but on force, ideology, and the claim to represent historical inevitability. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed on March 3, 1918, demonstrated how quickly revolutionary idealism gave way to brutal pragmatism. Germany demanded enormous territorial concessions. Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Finland, and parts of the Caucasus. Russia lost 34% of its population, 32% of its agricultural land, 54% of its industrial capacity, and 89% of its coal mines. Lenin's own party split over whether to accept such humiliating terms. Left communists wanted revolutionary war against German imperialism. Trotsky proposed a policy of neither war nor peace. Lenin understood that the Bolsheviks had no army capable of fighting and that losing power over principles meant losing the revolution entirely. He forced the treaty through, arguing that breathing space mattered more than the territory. The treaty would be nullified by Germany's defeat 8 months later, but the precedent was set. Bolshevik survival trumped all other considerations. The outbreak of full-scale civil war in mid-1918 transformed the Soviet state into a military dictatorship. The Russian Civil War was not a simple two-sided conflict, but a chaotic melee involving Bolshevik Reds, anti-Bolshevik Whites, regional nationalists, peasant armies, and foreign interventionists from 14 countries. The Whites, led by former Tsarist generals like Denikin, Kolchak, and Wrangel, controlled vast territories and received weapons and supplies from Britain, France, the United States, and Japan. They should have won. They had military experience, foreign backing, and controlled Russia's most productive regions. Yet they lost because they represented restoration of the old order in a country where almost everyone wanted change. The Whites refused meaningful land reform, alienated national minorities, and often relied on brutal repression that made even Bolshevik methods seem restrained by comparison. Lenin's response to civil war was the creation of a system called War Communism, implemented from 1918 to 1921. This was not a planned economic policy, but an improvised survival mechanism that would leave scars on Soviet society for generations. War Communism had several key components. First, the nationalization of all industry, not gradually but immediately and completely. By 1920, even small workshops with 10 or more workers were state property. Second, the abolition of money as a meaningful medium of exchange. Wages were paid in rations. Third, and most catastrophically, forced grain requisitioning from the peasantry. Armed detachments of urban workers and Red Army soldiers swept through villages, confiscating grain at fixed prices that were often simply confiscation without payment. The state needed to feed the Red Army and industrial workers. Peasants who had just received land in the revolution now found themselves forced to surrender their harvest at gunpoint. The human cost of war communism was staggering. Industrial production collapsed to 14% of pre-war levels by 1921. The urban population of Petrograd fell from 2.4 million in 1917 to 574,000 in 1920, as people fled to the countryside seeking food. Money became nearly worthless. A pound of bread that cost half a ruble in 1917 cost 5,000 rubles by 1921. Barter replaced currency. Workers were paid in kind when they were paid at all. The black market, officially illegal and harshly punished, became the only way most people survived. The Bolsheviks called speculators and traders enemies of the people. Yet without these underground networks, millions more would have starved. The Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, became the instrument of Bolshevik terror. Founded in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka operated outside legal constraints. It could arrest, interrogate, and execute without trial. Dzerzhinsky, an ascetic Polish revolutionary who slept in his office and worked himself to exhaustion, believed that revolutionary terror was a moral necessity. The Cheka was not a secret police force in the traditional sense. It was an ideological weapon designed to eliminate entire categories of people deemed class enemies. Former nobles, priests, merchants, kulaks, and anyone associated with the old regime faced arrest. The numbers are disputed and incomplete, but conservative estimates suggest the Cheka executed at least 50,000 people between 1918 and 1921. Some historians place the figure much higher, perhaps 140,000 or more. These figures do not include those who died in Cheka prisons or labor camps. The Red Terror, officially proclaimed in September 1918 after an assassination attempt on Lenin, was systematic political violence as state policy. Lenin himself, recovering from bullet wounds that would affect his health for the rest of his life, approved and encouraged mass reprisals. In a telegram to Bolsheviks in Penza dealing with a peasant uprising, Lenin wrote on August 11, 1918, ordering them to hang at least 100 kulaks publicly, seize their grain, and take hostages so that people for hundreds of miles around would see and tremble. This was not the action of a government responding to immediate threats, but a deliberate strategy of intimidation through exemplary violence. The Bolsheviks believed that terror, properly applied, could transform social consciousness. If the old ruling classes were eliminated, if resistors were punished with sufficient severity, a new socialist society would emerge. The execution of the Romanov family in Ekaterinburg on July 17, 1918, symbolized the finality of the Bolshevik break with Russia's past. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, and 4 servants were taken to a basement and shot. The bodies were bayoneted, doused with acid, and buried in an unmarked grave. The local Bolsheviks who carried out the execution claimed they acted on their own initiative to prevent the whites from liberating the family as they advanced on the city. Most historians now believe Lenin and the central leadership approved the decision. The execution eliminated any possibility of the monarchy's restoration and sent an unmistakable message. The revolution would not be reversed. There would be no compromise with the old order. The Bolsheviks would win, or they would destroy everything in the attempt. Peasant resistance to grain requisitioning produced some of the most significant but least remembered conflicts of Lenin's era. The Tambov Rebellion, which began in August 1920 and continued into 1921, saw up to 50,000 peasants under the leadership of Alexander Antonov fighting against Bolshevik authority. These were not white guards or monarchists, but peasants who had supported the revolution and now felt betrayed by it. They wanted the whites gone, but they also wanted to be left alone with their land. The Red Army response, directed by Mikhail Tukhachevsky, employed tactics that foreshadowed later Soviet methods. Entire villages suspected of supporting rebels were burned. Hostage-taking became routine. Chemical weapons, including poison gas, were used to clear forests where rebel bands hid. The rebellion was crushed by mid-1921, but it demonstrated that Bolshevik power in the countryside rested on coercion, not consent. The famine of 1921 to 1922 was the catastrophic culmination of war communism's failures. A drought in 1921 affected the Volga region, Ukraine, and southern Russia, but the famine's severity resulted from years of agricultural disruption. Grain requisitioning had destroyed peasant incentive to produce surplus. The Civil War had devastated transportation networks. Livestock herds were decimated. When the drought hit, there were no reserves. The famine affected approximately 30 million people. Mortality estimates range from 5 to 10 million deaths. People ate grass, bark, and, in documented cases, resorted to cannibalism. The Bolshevik government, after initially denying the famine's existence, eventually accepted foreign aid from the American Relief Administration, led by Herbert Hoover. This aid probably saved millions of lives, yet the Soviet government resented the dependence and the implicit admission that their system had failed. Lenin's response to the crisis was the new economic policy, announced in March 1921 at the 10th Party Congress. NEPI was a strategic retreat from war communism, a partial restoration of market mechanisms that Lenin called state capitalism. Forced grain requisitioning was replaced with a tax in kind. Peasants could sell surplus on the open market. Small-scale private trade and manufacturing were legalized. The commanding heights of the economy Heavy industry, banking, foreign trade remained in state hands. But everyday economic life was partially decentralized. NEP was politically controversial. Cheat. Many Bolsheviks saw it as betrayal of socialist principles. Lenin argued it was temporary, a necessary compromise to rebuild the economy and maintain the worker-peasant alliance. In practice, NEP would last until Stalin's forced collectivization in 1929. The results of NEP were dramatic. Agricultural production recovered relatively quickly. By 1925, grain output reached pre-war levels. Small traders called NEP men emerged, operating shops and businesses. A degree of normalcy returned to daily life. Money regained meaning. Consumer goods reappeared. Yet NEP created its own contradictions. The Bolsheviks had made a revolution to abolish capitalism, and now capitalist relationships were returning under their watch. The NEP men, though economically useful, were socially stigmatized and politically vulnerable. The party could tolerate them as a temporary measure, but never accepted them as legitimate. This ambiguity would make NEP inherently unstable. Life in Soviet cities under Lenin was characterized by scarcity, surveillance, and social upheaval. Housing was nationalized, with bourgeois apartments subdivided and assigned to multiple families. The communal apartment, or kommunalka, became a defining feature of Soviet urban life. Families who had never met now shared kitchens, bathrooms, and corridors. Privacy disappeared. These arrangements were justified as temporary measures during the housing crisis, but they became permanent features of Soviet life, lasting in many cases until the USSR's collapse. The kommunalka was both a practical response to housing shortages and a social engineering experiment. Communal living was supposed to break down bourgeois individualism and create collective consciousness. In reality, it often produced conflict, resentment, and opportunities for mutual surveillance. Education and culture underwent radical transformation. The Bolsheviks launched massive literacy campaigns. In 1917, perhaps 40% of the population could read and write. By 1926, the figure approached 60%. New schools opened throughout the country. Education was declared free and universal. The curriculum emphasized science, materialism, and political indoctrination. Traditional subjects were taught, but always within a framework that stressed class struggle and historical materialism. The revolution sought to create a new type of human being, freed from religious superstition and bourgeois mentality. Whether this succeeded is debatable, but the attempt was genuine and far-reaching. The Russian Orthodox Church faced systematic persecution. Religion was denounced as opium of the people, a tool of class oppression. Church property was confiscated. Thousands of priests were arrested, executed, or sent to labor camps. Religious instruction for anyone under 18 was banned. Churches were closed or converted to warehouses, clubs, and museums. The campaign reached its peak in 1922 when the government used the famine as pretext to seize church valuables, supposedly for famine relief. When Patriarch Tikhon protested, show trials of clergy followed. 54 people were executed. The assault on religion was not peripheral to the Bolshevik project, but central to it. A socialist society required socialist consciousness, and that meant eliminating competing worldviews. Women's status changed dramatically under Bolshevik rule, at least in law. The 1918 Family Code established civil marriage, easy divorce, and equal rights for women. Abortion was legalized in 1920, making Soviet Russia the first country to do so. Women were encouraged to enter the workforce and public life. Alexandra Kollontai, the most prominent female Bolshevik, advocated for the socialization of housework and childcare to free women from domestic slavery. In practice, implementation was uneven. Traditional attitudes persisted, especially in rural areas and among Muslim populations in Central Asia. Women did enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers, but often out of economic necessity rather than liberation. They worked in factories and fields while still bearing primary responsibility for housework and childcare. The promised communal kitchens and childcare centers were built in insufficient numbers. Soviet women gained legal equality but faced double burdens. National minorities experienced contradictory policies. The Bolsheviks opposed Russian chauvinism and promised self-determination. The early Soviet state was organized as a federation of national republics. Local languages were promoted. Indigenous cadres were recruited into party and government. This policy, called korenizatsiya or indigenization, represented a genuine attempt to address national grievances. Yet self-determination had strict limits. When Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan declared independence, the Red Army invaded and incorporated them into the Soviet Union by 1921. Self-determination meant the right to socialist development within the Soviet framework, not the right to leave. Lenin personally oversaw the forcible reincorporation of the Caucasus, revealing that proletarian internationalism trumped national sovereignty when the two conflicted. The creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics